Okay, so thank you for having me, everybody. Photography is valued because it can produce visual records of features of photographed scenes through a causal recording process. That's what I'm particularly interested in today. Tradition has it that the photographic process allows the world to imprint itself, yielding its own reproduction. And this is associated with the notion that photography is a mind-independent recording medium. I call this the idea that photography is fundamentally a recording medium, and it's the view I wish to challenge in this paper. I will instead argue that photography is only functionally a recording medium. Photographs can be records of photographed scenes and fulfill this function in an exemplary way, but it's not necessary that a photograph be a record of a photographed scene. On the fundamental view, every photograph must be a record just insofar as it is a photograph. On the functional view, photography is well suited to produce records if specific contingent conditions are met, but a photograph can still be a photograph when it does not meet these conditions. The idea that recording is fundamental to the photographic process, I will suggest, is part and parcel of what I call a single stage view that can be traced to the inception of photography and has become orthodoxy among photographers, historians, and theorists. In analytic philosophy, it has led to mind independence becoming a defining feature of photographs. A single stage view supposes that a photographic image is generated during the period when a camera exposes a photosensitive surface to light. This is the view of photography that I'll challenge here, and I'll be proposing an alternative multi-stage account. In the terms of my alternative account, exposure of a photosensitive surface to light is a necessary first stage in the production of a photographic image, but not by itself sufficient. Subsequent process stages are necessary before a photographic image is produced. I shall argue that as the single stage view of the photographic process and the view that photography is essentially a recording medium are so closely entangled that once the single stage view is rejected, the motivations for the fundamental view are removed. The claim that photography produces mind-independent images is then undermined, and the ground can be cleared to accommodate an expanded range of photographic pictures, and I'll be talking about some examples. So I'll proceed as follows. In section 2, I'll spell out the single stage view and explain its appeal. And I'll also explain how it motivates the, I'll also explain the alternative multi-stage view. In section 3, I'll explain how the single stage view motivates the idea that photography is fundamentally a recording medium, and consequently the idea that photographs are by definition mind-independent images. In section 4, I'll seek assistance from John Korwicki's work on recording and representation, particularly his account of witless photographic recording. I suggest that the model offered by the single stage account of an all-in-one recording reproduction event is a myth. In section 5, I'll use the multi-stage account to show that alongside witless records, photography can produce witty depictive images, and both types of image have an equal claim to be photographs. So, starting with the single and multi-stage accounts of photography. Single and multi-stage accounts of photography share a common starting point before they diverge. The preliminary step in any photographic process is to arrange an array of light. And what you can see in front of you is an example of an array of light that has been produced as a preliminary to a photographic process. So what you're seeing inside the viewer of this Hasselblad camera is not yet a photograph. I mean, obviously, in the sense of the image as a whole is a photograph, but if you were there peering inside the viewer of the camera for yourself, you would be looking at this preliminary stage of the process, the array of light. Conventional photographic images begin with light that is channeled through an aperture into a dark chamber, a camera obscura. Light arriving at the aperture has been emitted by or reflected from the surrounding objects, as you can see here. Inside the camera, light is directed onto a surface to form an array of dark and bright areas of intensity, and lenses and filters sharply focus the diffuse array to produce an optical light image. So if you can imagine it, the light arriving through the aperture into this dark chamber could have just been a diffuse array with no determinate features, but it's thanks to the focusing and filtering that occurs that you see not just an array of light, but an optical light image. And this phenomenon of an optical light image is an entrancing curiosity. It inspired and obsessed the pioneers of photography. Obviously, they weren't looking through the viewfinder or Hasselblad, they were looking at a camera obscura, perhaps inside a darkened room, either with a pinhole aperture or other ways in which camera obscura images could be formed historically. But a camera obscura image is a visual image with size, shape, and location on a surface. It consists of highly detailed, differentiated areas of colour and contrasting tones. And crucially, although you can't see it here in the example I'm showing you, it reacts to real-time changes in the scene and changes in the camera. So the light image may appear static or it may appear dynamic, depending on what's going on in the scene. But above all, it's an ephemeral image. The view inside the camera obscura is a view of the outside world, selected, reflected, inverted, scaled, flattened. The clouds move, the shadows deepen, but at some point, the captivating light image must completely disappear. The pioneers of photography decided that they would compel the light image to remain. They wanted it seized, arrested, fixed. However, they were not content to trace a reproduction of the light image by hand. They instead wanted to record the image by making it autonomously reproduce itself. So Tolbert described his invention as fixing upon paper the image formed by the camera obscura, or rather, I should say, causing it to fix itself. In a partnership agreement signed by Niepce and Daguerre, they attributed to Niepce the discovery of a new method consisting in the spontaneous reproduction of the images of nature received in a camera obscura. Hippolyte Gauchelard reported that Monsieur Daguerre has discovered a method to fix the images that are represented at the back of a camera obscura, so that those images are not the temporary reflection of the object, but their fixed and durable impress, which may be removed from the presence of those objects, like a picture or engraving. These, and many similar descriptions of the photographic process, show the emergence of the single-stage view of photography. And I'm going to outline that view and then afterwards say more about recording and reproduction. So we've seen examples of an optical light image, but when an optical light image has formed, it is not yet a photographic image. A necessary step for generating a photographic image is to expose the light image to a photosensitive surface. Single and multi-stage accounts diverge at the point at which they characterize the process stages that lie in between a light image and a photographic image. Now, both accounts accept that there are numerous sequential tasks that have to be performed in the production of any photograph. So single and multi are not an indication of some particular number of tasks that have to be performed. Instead, they are labels that indicate different answers to the question, within what stage or stages of the process does a photographic image come into existence? And single stage applies to any account that is committed either implicitly or explicitly to answering that a photographic image is created during the period in which the photosensitive surface is exposed to light. Single-stage accounts recognise, of course, that secondary stages may be necessary to reveal or display or modify the photographic image, but the crucial feature is that they suppose that these tasks always come after the image has already been created. Reporting on the daguerreotype method, one 19th century author explained that during exposure, the light image becomes perfectly imprinted on a photosensitized metal plate. At the end of the exposure time, there is no visible image, yet the image has already been affixed to the plate invisibly. All that remains is to make the invisible light image visible by applying mercury fumes. That's what you can see here. This idea remains the template for 21st century single stage accounts, which are committed to the notion that a photographic image exists once a photosensitive surface has been exposed to light from the scene. So the single stage account tells us that during an exposure, the photographic image has been produced. And their idea is that an image created during exposure exists either as an invisible latent image on undeveloped film or as a digital file, and it is subsequently developed, printed or screened. But crucially, the photographic image has come into existence at that first stage. Now, I'm turning now to the multi-stage accounts to give you the comparison. A multi-stage account does not simply start with a single stage view and then add further stages. Instead, the multi-stage account reconceives how to think about the relationship between separate process stages, and it offers an entirely different way to understand photographic images. So crucially, a multi-stage account denies that a photographic image comes into existence during an exposure stage. Instead, it acknowledges that the exposure of light to a photosensitive surface is a distinctive causal phenomenon. It's a phenomenon I've given the label a photographic event. And of course, a photographic event in that sense is effectively similar to what a single stage account is going to call an exposure, but an exposure is different to a photographic event. But crucially, on a multi-stage account, that event is not the production of a photographic image. During the photographic event, there is causal registration of the light that forms the optical light image. And a detail that I'm really focusing on here in this paper is that the photographic event is causal registration of the light rather than causal registration of the image. The image, the formal properties of the image, you might say, doesn't cause material changes in the photosensitive surface. It's only the light arriving that causes the material changes. So that's the first stage of the multi-stage account. So I'll say a little bit more about what has to happen next. In photochemical technology, we have silver halide emulsion coating a surface. And when light starts to arrive on the silver halide emulsion, microspecks of metal start to appear in the emulsion thanks to a reaction of the intensity of light that arrives on that surface. And the way to think about this is that material changes in the emulsion are a tally of the quantity of light that's arrived during the photographic event distributed across the surface. And the result of a photographic event is what I call a register. So it's not a photographic image, it's a register of the changes. When the photographic event ends, only a register exists. No image yet exists, visible or invisible. To create a photographic image, another stage is necessary. The photographic register must undergo chemical treatments to render a stable visual image. And image rendering does not reveal an already existing image, as the single stage account tells us. Instead, image rendering uses a photographic register to bring a visual image into being, and some features of the image will be determined by the image rendering process. After the stages of registration and rendering are complete, this is when a photographic image exists. So I hope you can see from that the idea that a multi-stage account requires that both of these stages contribute properties to the photographic image, whereas the single stage account suggests that the properties of the photographic image have been established during the first stage. Now, turning to photoelectrical processes, likewise, these do not produce an image during an exposure. The pixels of an electronic sensor tally the light they receive as electrical charge and deliver electronic signals to produce a digital file. As you may have seen yourself with your own cameras, if the step between light registration to image rendering is automated and occurs in a fraction of a second, the production of a photographic image can seem simultaneous with the exposure time. It's got that sense of instantaneity, and it creates the impression of a single stage account. But of course, that step between registration and the algorithm generating a visual image can be interrupted. And I think it's quite straightforward to acknowledge, in line with the multi-stage account, that a digital file is not a photographic image. I'm calling a digital file a register rather than an image. So that's the contrast between the two accounts. So I'll just say a little bit more about the difference between them. So single and multi-stage views both seek to accommodate photochemical and photoelectrical production processes, and they seek to accommodate all varieties of photographic technology, from heliographs and calotypes through to Polaroids and digital photography. It's interesting that the single stage view originated in photochemical photography, and it has retained its influence into the digital era, even though, as we've just seen in this example, it's no longer a perfect fit. But the multi-stage account emerged in an era of photoelectrical photography, where, as we can see here, it carries plausibility. But the multi-stage account faces a challenge to overturn the orthodox account of photochemical processes. Given that, it might be tempting to think that we could classify photochemical photography as single stage and photoelectrical photography as multi-stage. But I'm suggesting that would not be accurate. I believe that the multi-stage account is correct for both types of photography, indeed all types of photography. The single stage view is a deep misconception of photography. It's not an alternate type of photography. The arrival of digital photography has not spelled the end of the single stage orthodoxy, and that's mainly because the single stage view has had a very influential legacy. During its period of unchallenged dominance, the single stage view has installed a normative principle that is used to define photographs. This is the photograph that this is the principle that what we might call a pure photograph, or a strict or ideal or authentic or genuine photograph, is necessarily a visual image that has acquired its properties mind independently. And to fully understand how mind independence is the legacy of the single stage view, I want to turn now to the idea that photography is fundamentally a recording medium. So, reproductions, if we were to, for example, attempt to reproduce the image that we see in front of us now, reproductions need not be the product of a recording process. It's possible to produce reproductions by hand, guided by conscious control. If any of you are particularly good with watercolours or pen and ink or something, you could produce a reproduction of the image that you're looking at in front of you by hand, but you would do so guided by conscious control. The key attraction of a photographic reproduction is the prospect of a causal recording process that does not rely on conscious control. A footprint in the snow reproduces the outline shape of a boot through a causal recording process. When the boot shape is causally imprinted in the snow, it leaves behind a reproduction of its shape. So there, the physical imprint is at one and the same time a recording of the shape, and it is a reproduction of the shape. This is a mind-independent causal recording process, but it's also an all-in-one model of causal recording, because the very same physical imprint is doing the job both of recording and of reproducing the boot shape. That's what I mean by all-in-one. The single stage view makes the error of using impression as a model to explain the production of a photographic image. And if you look through the history of writing about photography, this terminology of the idea of an impress and an imprint and impression plays a significant role in a lot of places. In photochemical technology, recording and reproduction has been conceived of as an all-in-one process. The camera obscura image is, it is claimed, recorded in the photosensitive surface, and the photographic image is none other than a reproduction of the camera obscura image. This combination of ideas explains why photography appears to be fundamentally a recording medium. So let me show you how this works. So when we look at reports of the invention of photographic processors, we find that they repeatedly feature two linked ideas. The first idea, is that the camera obscura image reproduces itself. That's what we saw in those quotes from Talbot and Daguerre and Niepce. The second idea is that the photographic image has produced itself autonomously. That's why we find that it's different to producing a painting or a drawing. This is an image that has produced itself. And these two ideas, which are separate ideas, are made to fit together. So the ephemeral camera obscura image reproduces itself by forming a stable photographic image. That's just how it manages to reproduce itself. And similarly, or putting things the other way round, the photographic image is said to autonomously create itself in the action of a camera obscura image spontaneously reproducing itself. In other words, again, this is how a photographic image comes into being, it is claimed. And what I'm suggesting is that these separate phenomena, the reproduction of the camera obscura image and the production of the photographic image, are being treated as if they are two descriptions of a single event. And this is the basis of the idea that we have an all-in-one recording reproduction event at the heart of the photographic process. So, early accounts of photography make it clear that a photographic image is considered a reproduction of the light image. But before long, typical accounts begin to gloss over the intermediary role played by the light image and treat the photographic image as a reproduction of the scene before the camera. So instead of thinking about the light image that's playing a role inside the camera apparatus, we get accounts that start to think simply about the relationship between the photographic image and the scene that lies in front of the camera and ignores the light image in between. So Talbot, for example, claimed that Laycock Abbey was the first building in history to have drawn its own picture. And according to Rudolf Arnheim, the fundamental peculiarity of the photographic medium is the fact that physical objects themselves print their image by means of the optical and chemical action of light. So what we're getting here is this idea that it's the world imprinting itself now through the photographic medium. Rob Hopkins has observed that the idea of allowing the world to form its own image by a process of imprinting is central to photography's self-conception. And turned around, this is found in the everyday notion that photography records the appearance of the world in front of the camera, which I think you'll agree is a fairly commonplace understanding of what's going on when somebody is using a camera to take a photograph. And I suggest to you, I'd be interested to hear your reactions about this, but I think that the original idea that photography reproduces a light image would seem alien to most people. And most people think of it, a photograph, as recording what's in front of the camera rather than recording a light image. But this self-image is the conception of recording that lies behind many philosophical discussions of photography. the idea that photographs are records of the photographed scene is commonly invoked, for example, to draw a fundamental distinction between photographic and non-photographic images, most evidently in discussions about the epistemic value of photography, but also found in aesthetic debate. So when Roger Scruton constructs a contrast between the logical ideals of painting on the one hand and photography on the other, he claims that an ideal photograph, and again this is this notion of a pure, strict, genuine photograph, an ideal photograph has a merely causal relation to its subject. So it is a record of how an actual object looked. That's what he builds into the definition. Greg Curry, drawing different conclusions, but with a similar structure to his argument, contrasts painting and photography and claims that a camera records what is in front of it, not what the photographer thinks is in front of it. And the idea that fundamentally a photograph is a kind of record that reproduces features of the photographed scene in front of the camera is aligned with theories that make mind-independent counterfactual dependence a defining characteristic of photographs. The central claim is that determinate features of photographs are counterfactually dependent on determinate features of the scene, because those properties were transferred via a mind-independent reproduction process. Versions of this idea feature in work by Greg Curry on visible traces, Hopkins on accuracy, Scruton on aesthetic skepticism, Walton on transparency, Walden on objectivity. And the reason I'm drawing your attention to this and wanting to challenge it is because I think that photographic images that fall short of that threshold, in other words, that don't meet the definition of mind-independent counterfactual dependence, are not considered photographs in a full sense, or it's claimed that they only partially exhibit the qualities, transparency, objectivity, accuracy, that a full exemplar would possess. So theories with a commitment to mind independence have collectively established a tradition that carries normative force. And again, I'll be interested to see whether you think I'm right about this. The normative force of this idea is that any genuine photograph, a photograph that is being strictly defined, is necessarily a mind-independent record of the photographed scene. And anything other than that is considered a departure from that paradigm. The pioneers of photography viewed an all-in-one recording reproduction event as the fundamental basis for the photographic process. This established the single-stage view as orthodoxy, and photographic recording has been considered an entirely causal process that bypassed the conscious control of the photographer. On this view, the photographic image is necessarily autonomous rather than authored, and the idea has evolved into the normative principle that mind independence must be specified in the photograph. The idea that photography is fundamentally a recording medium comes as a package with this normative constraint on how photographs are to be defined. So, what I want to do now is examine the idea of recording and reproducing a bit more closely. Photographic images are sometimes called recordings, reproductions, records, and representations quite loosely, but these are not equivalent terms. And to gain a clear view of the different roles of these terms, I'm going to turn to help from John Korwicki, who in several of his works has got very extensive discussions of how to distinguish recordings from representations and to specify defining characteristics of recordings. I'm just taking a small corner of the work that he's doing more generally to make use of it in this argument, but obviously his account is more extensive. Kulvicki says that while representations have an intentional character, recordings are relational. The relation between a recording and what it records is witless, and it allows for playback. So the notion of witless here is the idea about the extent to which it depends on beliefs and intentional interventions by a human agent. Witless means that the process is causal, and as long as everything is working properly, no wits are required. Wits might be prerequisite to making such machines, but recording processes don't require those wits. Playback, and sometimes John refers to playback as the production of a replica of what has been recorded. So playback is a witless process whereby that which is recorded can be reproduced. Oh, sorry, I've gone on too far there. So although I'll just say a bit to elaborate what I'm taking from John's account. So although an object or an image of some kind may be commonly called a recording, what Kulvicki shows us is that recording needs to be understood as a relation, not as a particular kind of object. A recording is some state of affairs that relates the event that it records to some reproduction of that event. And specifically, a recording is a state of affairs that supports the reproduction of an abstract pattern. It relates one instance of a pattern to another instance of the same pattern. And in the example that John uses, he says that Descartes might be the source of a recording, but it's not possible to record Descartes. That's because Descartes is a unique object that cannot be reproduced. You couldn't have a replica of Descartes. It is nonetheless possible to record a pattern of light and dark that was caused by an object or scene and then reproduce that pattern. So in the case of Descartes, a photograph of Descartes would not reproduce Descartes, but would reproduce the pattern of light and dark that was recorded when Descartes stood before the camera. Kulvicki discusses the distinction between recording and representation. The visible pattern that is witlessly reproduced by a photographic recording process may be taken up as the intentional content of a representation. So when you have a photographic portrait of Descartes, of course none exist because Descartes lived before photographs, but if you were to have a photographic portrait of Descartes or anybody else, the witless recording is taken up into an intentional representation in that particular case. But you can also have witless recordings that are independent of representation. So if Descartes were to have been caught by a speed camera, we're not introducing any notion of the intentionality and the representational content of that. It's a straightforward recording of the pattern of light and dark. And also there are many representations that have only intentional content without any recorded content. And an example of a painted portrait of Descartes would be an example that has only intentional content, no recorded content. Kulvicki does not suppose that photographs are fundamentally representational. As we've seen, he thinks some photographs can be representational and some don't. So that's because he has a functional account that explains how some photographs, but not all photographs, acquire intentional content and serve as representations. But I think it's implicit in his account that every photograph is the product of a recording process. And if that's left as it is, it would seem to endorse the view that photography is fundamentally a recording medium, which is of course the view that I'm challenging here. But in fact, I don't think that Kulvicki's position needs to point to that conclusion. I think that his account can be extended to support a functional multi-stage account of photography as a recording medium. That's what I'm effectively building in my own argument. So let's look at some detail about how I think that extension needs to be made to Kulwicki's account. Kulwicki acknowledges two types of recording. The first is an all-in-one process where the recording is already a reproduction. And I gave an example of that kind of process when I talked about the imprinting of a boot in the snow as an all-in-one recording reproduction process. But another type of recording is a process where reproduction is one step away from the recording. And he characterizes digital photography as an example. So the digital file is not yet a reproduction of the recorded pattern. We have to put it through a further process before the reproduction happens, so that it's one step away from the recording. It's not like an example of a boot making its own impression in the snow. I suggest that Kulwicki should also say the same about photochemical photography, but instead Kulwicki has used the daguerreotype as a paradigm of all-in-one recording reproduction. That's what you see in this quotation. He says that in daguerreotypes, the pattern burned into a sheet of silver records a pattern of light and dark, and also serves as a playback of that pattern because it is the pattern of light and dark that was recorded. Just look and you see reproduced the pattern that caused it. An all-in-one recording reproduction account of daguerreotypes would be correct if the single-stage account of photography were true, but it's not. Just like digital images, daguerreotypes are products of a multi-stage process. The photographic image is not a reproduction that was created when the recording occurred. As I've argued, after the photographic event, no image is visible. The image that serves as a visible playback of the recording, when you actually look at a daguerreotype and see the visual image, has only been created thanks to a contingent image rendering process. The way that mercury fumes are the way that the daguerreotype plate is exposed to mercury fumes and affected by the mercury fumes is part of how the image gets its properties. It's one step away from the recording process. But the significance of that secondary step was not apparent in reports by Daguerre, Talbot and others, because they believed that an invisible latent image and the visible patent image were one and the same image. In other words, they thought that what was being revealed by the mercury fumes was the image that was already there on the metal plate, and the mercury fumes were just making the invisible image become visible. But that's what I'm denying. Talbot misleadingly claimed that during the image rendering stage, an invisible latent image developed itself through a spontaneous action. Now, that would certainly count as a witless playback of a recording, to meet Kulwicki's terms, but it's not proof of an all-in-one recording reproduction process. So I'm arguing that all the types of photography have this recording reproduction process that is at one step removed. None of them have an all-in-one recording reproduction process at their heart. And I'm suggesting that Kulwicki could adopt that or extend his claim to accept that point, and it would make better sense of or better use at least of his recording reproduction theory. In the following section, I'll use the multi-stage account to argue that photography is only functionally a recording medium, just as it is functionally rather than fundamentally a representing medium. I'll extend Kulwicki's account to argue that many photographic images are witless reproductions from recordings, but not all. Photography properly includes images that are witty as well as those that are witless. So, and this is where I'll give you some examples and see what you think to these as well. So according to the multi-stage account, recording and reproduction are not all in one within the exposure stage. The photographic image does not generate itself autonomously when a photosensitive surface is exposed to light. Instead, registration of light takes place during the photographic event, and once an image is rendered from the register, the photographic image can, in some cases, be considered a recorded reproduction of the light image. But whether it is or is not a record is an open question. It's going to be settled by facts about how the register was produced and how the register was used to render the photographic image. If the process has been set up in an appropriate way and end-to-end stages of the whole process are fully witless, then the result is a record. Otherwise, it is not. And there's nothing in photography as a sort of essentially as a process that makes it fundamentally the case that photographic images are records. It is a contingent, functionally determined matter. A photographic image is a photographic record when the image has been reproduced by witless light registration and witless image rendering. Neither process can be strictly correctly described as mind independent, although if we follow Kulwicki, for a recording or playback process to be witless, we have to have a system that bypasses human interventions. The single stage view can afford to assume that so long as everything during the exposure stage is witless, the production of the photographic image is fundamentally witless. But the multi-stage view recognises that a witless photographic event does not yet determine that the photographic image is witless playback. It may be, it may not. Even if the first stage is witless, there are two possibilities. There may be a witless second stage, or a photographer may intervene, in which case the photographic image is not an entirely witless playback. And I'm going to introduce the term witty to characterise photographic process stages that are not entirely witless. So, a recording is a relation between two instances of a pattern, and it must support a witless playback, otherwise it's not a recording. But registration, which is the causal notion that I'm highlighting, is not a relation between instances of a pattern. Registration is just a causal relation between a distribution of light and the effects that have been caused by that light. It's not a relation between two instances of a pattern. A register, however, can be used to create an image that's a witless playback, and it can be used to create an image that is not a witless playback. It's a register in both cases, but it would only count as a recording in the fully witless case. So I'm sort of saying that registration is the sort of the foundational distinctive photographic part of the process, which the recording process is built upon effectively. You could have sound recording that's built upon a different process, but in the photographic case, I'm saying that causal registration of this kind is how you build the account of reproduction. Norms and standards have been established to ensure success at every process stage in the photographic process, but the undesirable legacy of single-stage orthodoxy is that failure to live up to the norms of being a recording have been treated as failure to live up to the norms of being a photograph. So this is where I think it gets interesting. The multi-stage account does not support the normative principle that mind independence is the paradigm case of a photographic image. It recognises four schematic possibilities: witless registration followed by witless rendering, witless registration followed by witty rendering, witty registration followed by witless rendering, and witty registration followed by witty rendering. The first of these is an entirely witless production process, whereas the other three are witty in various ways and to different degrees. But what I'm arguing is that all four modes of production count equally and fully as photographic images. That's why I think it's a mistake to think that mind independence is a defining feature of photographic image, because that would only count the first of these four as strictly speaking a photograph. It rules out the other three. And I'm arguing that all four of these count strictly as photographs. Let's take an example of witless registration. Oops, sorry. Yes, actually, I will start with this example. So I'm going to use this witty self-portrait by Vincent Dual to illustrate the modes of production. And I'll be coming back to this. So let's start with witless registration followed by witless rendering. So Dual sat in front of the camera, and light reflecting from his face was focused to form an optical light image inside the camera. And then a photographic event occurred. Light arriving at the photosensitive film surface caused material changes in the emulsion. Once the photographic event ended, a register consisting of the material changes was removed from the camera. And note that the register that was taken out of the camera was not a record, a reproduction, or a representation. In fact, it wasn't an image either. The register was immersed in developing fluid, which caused microscopic catalysts to grow into large grains of silver and produce a visible image. The photographic image was chemically fixed to halt the rendering process, and the resultant negative image is a photographic record. So obviously I'm not showing you an example here of the negative that Vincent Dual produced when he made his portrait. I don't have the example of the negative. But I am claiming that a photographic negative is a photographic image. Even though it's a negative image, it's a photographic image. And the photographic negative is an instance of a pattern that was witlessly recorded and produced by witless playback. So I'm going to use that as an example of a photographic record. There are lots of other things that count as records, but just in this particular sequence, I'm going to use that as this first example. Photochemical methods that have a negative-positive process require two photographic events to take place and two image rendering steps. So the first register that has been rendered into a negative photographic image, that's where we're at this stage of events. But the negative must now be taken into the darkroom to stage a second photographic event. So now we're onto a different kind of production process. Inside the darkroom, the negative image was placed in an enlarger, and a second optical light image was formed, and a second photographic event occurred. The light shining through the negative was registered by causal changes in photosensitive paper. That was a witless process. And it would have been possible to take the witlessly registered undeveloped image and put it in developing fluid, immerse it in developing fluid and produce a visible image. But that's not what Dual did in producing his image. He chose not to render the image using a standard witless method. Instead, he selectively finger painted developing fluid over the surface of the register. It's layered in some places and large gaps untouched elsewhere. And if I go in and show you the close-up details, you can see some of the contouring effects that happen because it has been layered. He then fixed the register in a stop bath to prevent further change. This is an example of witty image rendering in every sense of the word. The result is not a witless reproduction of a recorded pattern, it's a photographic picture. A restrictive definition of photography, which includes mind independence as a normative condition of an image counting as a photograph, must say that this is a self-portrait that is not a photograph. Some theories would classify it as a drawing or a painting, but the multi-stage view can claim categorically that this is a photographic image without claiming that it's a record of the photographed scene. So This is another close-up detail where you can see the effects. So I just want to show you two other examples. So a photographic picture can be the product of witless light registration combined with witty image rendering, but interestingly, witty light registration is also possible. And here it's often supposed that techniques of dodging and burning are interventions at the image rendering stage of the process. So when you hear people trying to give an account of how photographic art has been produced and people say, oh, the image dodging and burning has happened and that's how people have intentionally controlled the representational content, it makes it sound as if that's happening as a kind of manipulation or post-processing stage of the image rendering process. But what I'm arguing is that dodging and burning take place during the occurrence of a photographic event. So enlargement printing requires light to be projected through the negative and focused to produce an optical light image. The negative in this case is a static scene. It's not like the dynamic images of the clouds moving across the landscape that you see, but it's temporally active and it's causally responsive to changing light conditions. So dodging is a technique for reducing the amount of light that's arriving on the photosensitive surface. Burning is a technique to increase the relative amount of light in a selective area. These are commonly used techniques that allow a photographer to consciously control how light is registered, and they give the photographic register intentionally determined features. So I'm arguing that a photographic event can be a witty process. It's not necessarily a witless process. And I've claimed that the photographic event occurring in a darkroom can be witty as well as witless. And the really big move is to say, well, the same can be true for all photographic events, whether photochemical or photoelectrical, because the formation of an optical light image and the controlled management of the registration of light can be the basis of a photographic event that's either witty or witless, followed by image rendering of either kind. And the example I'd like to show you here is the idea of a photographic event taking place outside the camera, outside the dark room. So a witty photographic event taking place in the darkroom is dodging and burning. And I would suggest that this project of light drawing by Jean Millet and Pablo Picasso is an example of dodging and burning taking place in a studio. So the room is dark. Millet illuminates Picasso with a single flash of light so that we can see Picasso himself. But in the darkness, Picasso uses a lighter or a small torch to draw an image, in a representational image in the darkness. And the photographic event, a long exposure, registers the light and dark arriving during that photographic event. And when it's developed, we get to see a witty production process. So I think with time, I'll move straight to my conclusion. So I claimed at the outset that it's orthodoxy that photography is fundamentally a recording medium, and there is some truth in this generalization. But under cross-examination, I think few people, if any, would commit to a full-blooded version of the view. Perhaps no one would insist that without exception, every product of the photographic process is necessarily a record of the photograph seen. And I don't think that means I've targeted a straw man. I think that I've revealed a man that's made of straw. And that's because my aim has been to expose significant misconceptions that arise if photographic recording is treated as the paradigm for defining a photograph. The truth in the generalization is the widely held assumption that only those photographic images that are records count as photographs. I've argued that a multi-stage functional account of photography can acknowledge the importance of photographic records on the one hand, but without privileging that category over photographic images that are not records of the photographed scene. The word photo or photograph is a generic term that's been used to refer to various objects that display the visible effects of being marked by light. And it might seem that photograph is a useful term to apply to a wide category of items. On the contrary, I think in analytic philosophy of photography and beyond, photograph has become an unhelpful term because it conflates separate process stages, it obscures different technological functions and different practical techniques. And most significant, and you can see that what I've tried to do with the multi-stage account is pull apart some of those aspects that have been compressed. But most significantly, photograph has evolved into a term with normative force that treats a narrow range of cases as a restrictive standard and treats contingent functional factors as necessary fundamental conditions. This has led to epistemic dogmatism and aesthetic skepticism. To understand how photography functions as a recording medium, it's necessary to consider what goes on inside and outside the black box, to recognise different roles played by the optical light image, the photographic register, the photographic image, and the photographic picture. And I would suggest that only then is it possible to develop a full picture of the witty and witless capacities of the photographer. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Dawn. This was very, very stimulating. Let me remind to people the rules of the game for the Q&A session. Whoever wants to raise raise a question, just write as Andrea has made the question on the chat or just queue, and I will keep track of the order of people. Okay, Andrea first.
Okay, thank you very much, Dawn, for the really interesting talk. I have two really short questions. The first is about the case in which photography process is not entirely witless, as you said. Well, I was wondering whether in this your functional account, it is possible to say that at least in some cases, like Picasso image, for example, there are both a figurative and something like also a pictorial content in a photographic image. So also a content that is out of the figurative one, and that is in some way conventionally given. Like, for example, in Picasso example, or also in the cases in which photographer can act on the exposition, light exposition, and so on. This is my first point. The second is this. Let's take the case of one of the greatest trends nowadays, selfies. Well, it is really difficult to say that a selfie is a mind-independent object because you can, in some way, directly change the photographic image. You can decide to have a smile or not, or so on, and so doing you can modify the result consciously. So from this point of view, what do you think about this case? Can be an example against traditional and single stage view. Also just referring to a clear case of photographic image, because selfies are clearly photographic images, but I can consciously act on this kind of images. Thank you very much.
That's great, Andrea. Thank you. I mean, yes, that's fantastic. I'll speak to the second point first, actually, because so I guess the overall thing I would want to say is that I think moving to the multi-stage view, one of the consequences that becomes important is that the testimony of the photographer becomes much more significant whenever we're considering the image. So it becomes relevant what type of image it is. You know, the fact that selfie is a particular genre means that when we know something is a selfie, we have certain expectations about how it has been produced and what kind of intentional control might have been to be expected. And you can set alongside that the fact that speed cameras have a particular set of conventions governing and expectations governing how it was produced, and the way in which photographers' interventions have been bypassed, deliberately excluded from the process. So if you compare those two, a speed camera and a selfie production, it matters that different types of intentional conscious control happen at different places in the event. And I would think that if you go and have your photograph taken at an auto booth, you know, for a passport photograph, it's usual that that's treated as a fairly witless process. Whereas, of course, you can go into the same booth and produce a selfie if you wish, and the technology is exactly the same.
Yeah.
But the way that the person is controlling the relationship between their body and the causal registration of light and the image, I think is relevant, salient, significant, and so on. So I think we get a better story about that if we understand the multi-stage account than if we have the single stage account. Your first point, when you were saying that even in the cases where we have a sort of an artistic, figurative, pictorial content, you were saying that to an extent there may still be, did you say that there were conventions involved or something like that? Could you tell me more about what you meant by the kinds of conventions? Do you mean photographic conventions?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I mean, it seems to me that in that cases we have surely a figurative content like Picasso image, but also a figurative one that is conventionally given out of the first content or instead of the first content, a pictorial one, sorry, a pictorial content that is given out of the first content from a conventionally point of view, because of is decided by the author, I mean, of by the photographer. So it's not
Oh, I think you're muted again. Sorry. I think you've gone back on mute somehow. Can't hear you.
Andrea, we are no longer hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now, yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now? Okay. I don't know. There was a problem with the microphone. I don't know. So I was trying to say that at least in that cases there are there is out from the figurative content also a pictorial one that is completely decided by the photographer, and so from this point of view, I think it is possible to say probably that is conventionally given by the author of that picture. It's not a passive reproduction of the outside scene. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if I took the point.
No, I think as far as I understand what you mean is a difference between figurative and pictorial, for example. I think I would want to agree with that. And I also think, although I can't speak for him, I think that John Kulvicki's account of the relationship between recorded content and representational content might also fit with that suggestion. So he wants to say that you can have the as it were, the pattern. Think of it as an abstract, visible pattern that we don't think of as having any representational dimension. It's just a pure distribution of light and dark. And he thinks of that as being the bare bones content of the image. And that would be the recorded content, but taking up that bare bones content and then giving it what he calls augmented, fleshed out content is how the very same abstract pattern is given a representational dimension. It becomes pictorial, for example, or can do. So I think his account helps with what you're suggesting there, I think. And I would want to agree with that, broadly speaking.
Thank you very much.
Julia.
Thanks. So I guess I had a question that is in part related to Andrea's second point. So I just wanted to better understand this notion of wittiness or the mind independence or mind dependence that is involved on your account. So given the examples that you gave at the end, I was just struggling to think of cases where we would say there is no witness whatsoever. So it seems like at some point, so if the choices by an agent can occur both at recording or registering level and later on when the image is formed, then it seems like even the example of the speed cameras that has involved a choice. So someone decided to place the camera there and orient it in a certain direction. So I guess that surely that must not be the right way of interpreting your view, right?
It's okay. I'm glad really glad you've raised that, 'cause I think this is important, and I sometimes feel like I've got a really good grip on this, and other times think, oh, but does this make a difference? So I share some of your thoughts here. So the way I think about it is that I think the traditional idea is that photographic images are, in some special sense, independent of human production process. In some funny, slightly mystical way, they achieve this. Because they're this merely causal reproduction of what's there. And you get that sense when you think about people talking about the possibility of accidental photographs. The idea that you say, well, look, here's this image that I've got. And then somebody says, yes, but if the camera had gone off by accident, you'd have the same image. And we can't tell the difference between the two. And that's that idea of a kind of accidental counterpart, whereas it is claimed you don't get that accidental counterpart in other kinds of picture production. You know, it's harder to imagine it. So if we take that, we're led into thinking that the default or the paradigm for a photograph is one where human intervention is sort of on the outside of it. It's sort of almost like it would make itself. And I'm challenging that because I'm saying that even in the examples of photographs where we want to say that they are strictly witless, you know, for forensic reasons, scientific reasons, medical imaging reasons, you know, we want to say these are images that are strictly accurate and objective and reliable because human conscious control has been completely minimized. What I'm suggesting is that even in those cases, photographs only carry those epistemic qualities because we have a story to tell about where human intervention happened and where it didn't. In other words, it's not that the absence of human intervention just happens by itself, right? The absence of human intervention has to be something that's engineered into the process. And we have to know that it's happened properly as it should have done. So, for example, if you have a photograph, you capture a thief in action, and you want your photograph to be used as evidence in a court, you often have to write sworn testimony that your camera didn't have any funny settings, you haven't gone in and manipulated the image afterwards, nobody else has got hold of the file, and all of those things have to be actually testified for the image to serve as as if it's a speed camera image. And so all of that, I think, pushes in the direction of saying that I think that Vicky's point is that there can be a lot of design in how cameras work to produce images that, resemble a human field of vision, or, have clear focus that we can detect, all of that. But his point is that the design features only get you so far. What matters then is whether humans have intervened in the implementation of the technical process, and that's a different question. So I hope that kind of covers your thoughts, because I think that's an important issue here. So thank you.
Can I add just a follow-up? So I was just wondering, now this is very helpful. So I was just wondering to what extent then these features of photographs that we consider to be objective are so for conventional and contextual dependent reasons. So you might think that even in forms of pictures that we would think of as not objective in the same way, like a drawing, there are things that one does not control and one does not choose, and one lets it be. One splashes the paint and lets it go wherever, or I don't know, choice of material. I can't think of good examples. One is given these materials and does with those materials. I don't know. I'm sure that there are things that we can think of where we can say, well, this aspect, this was as a result of a choice or as a result of an intervention, and this other aspect wasn't. Even like, I don't know, in medical imaging, someone chose to push the button then. It's just that we know that for the purposes, practical purposes, legal reasons that we're interested in, sometimes these don't matter.
Yes, exactly.
Is it something you'll be happy with? Or?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that is what I mean, I'm always hesitant at a moment like this to sort of say, yes, I completely agree, because I wonder then what the implications are further down the line, for accepting something. But I do think that's right. So Dom Lopez, for example, when he's been writing about photography in this, and as you know, I mean, he's got a view of pictures where he's inclined to think that drawings and photographs are all on a continuum anyway. There's not a hard and fast line between the two types. But he does think that there are, if you sort of basically, he's got a sort of social practice account of what the norms are constraining different sorts of properties that different types of images might achieve better than others, and so on. And for him, that's to do with sets of social, epistemic social constraints, for example, normative practices, but they could have been otherwise. I think that's the idea. They could have been different, but given that they are the way they are, we can see that some images manage to satisfy that and others fall short, and so on. So I think broadly speaking, again, I'm kind of sympathetic to what Dom wants to say about appealing to social practices to give us those norms.
Fabrizio.
So thank you very much. I got just a very general curiosity. I was wondering how much of this discussion between single step, multi-stage is specific to photography, or can be extended also in the recording into other modalities. For instance, I'm thinking about auditory modality and voice recording, and here there is always this causal intuition that's the recording of exact that voice that can be also used in some trials. And on the other hand, there is always some form of transformation of the signal, so there's no single step at all. And probably there are also a parallel of the witless, witty recording, because you can extend how much sound waves you capture, so how much. So that's the question. So that's if there is a parallel discussion in the auditory modality, and what's your idea about that?
Yeah, I'm absolutely convinced that that's right. And I would love to be in a position where I deliver the argument that demonstrates exactly what you've just described, because everything you've just said is there in my mind as how I see this playing out in other processes, exactly like that. I haven't, all I do is I cheekily stick that in a footnote here or there, and I say, I think this will also work for a I think in I think in some way, and half of me hopes that somebody else will actually pick up on that thought and do the hard work for me. And part of me thinks, I hope no one else does it, because I want to actually argue that one day. So I'm very torn. But I think that's exactly right. And in many ways, this particular project, the way that as you can tell, the single stage, multi-stage thing is kind of the key idea that I've been working on in over different years, and I'm trying to explore different implications of it. And where I've arrived at with this paper is looking very specifically about claims about recording, because I've not addressed that. Oh, well, there's a bit more of a story to this, because in the past, when I very first wrote about multi-stage, I claimed that the photographic event was the recording of the light image. Right, that's how I used to characterize it. And when Dom Lopez and other people who talk about it, they still talk about it as a recording of the light image. So they treat recording as being fundamental to the multi-stage account. And that's my fault, because I used that terminology. But it was when I was speaking to a curator some years ago, and he said to me, I would accept everything you say, but I'm just really worried about how this can be. And it's given me 10 years of headache. And I finally arrived at that understanding that if you put recording in the causal claim, as if recording is built into the very essence of any photographic production process, then the trouble is it cheapens the notion of recording. You get recording for free, just insofar as something is a photograph, but then you can't differentiate. You've got no powers of discriminating between things that are and are not recording in a more interesting way. So I think I've pulled that apart a bit. And the consequence of me looking at recording in this detail brings me one step closer to doing, I think, what you've described, which is it makes it easier. Because I've always said in the past, oh, the multi-stage account would work for sound, but it's never been really obvious to see how that would happen. But I think as soon as you characterize it as registering and recording, then it's more apparent that that could work. So I've got this fantasy paper in my mind where one day I get to talk about the difference between fluffy microphones and hard recording microphones, and the difference this makes for registration. But so thank you very much. That's a great question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't see any other question in the chat, so maybe I can just join into the discussion. For two questions. The first one is exactly the same as Fabrizio's question, but I try to push it in a different direction, if you like. When you were talking about the distinction between the two stages, it came to my mind that the musical case of my favorite pop group, that is Pink Floyd, and for them, both recording and reproductions were witty because of the way in which they worked in the studios, in the Abbey Road studios, in which they first recorded the sounds of the instruments in a distorted way by using multiple tracks. And then they mixed up all the recordings that were recorded on these tracks by making a sort of sounds which definitely was not exactly the same as the sound that came out from the instrument. So definitely there is a very close similarity between the case of photographs and the case of sounds on the other end. But there is a distinction that is in the second case, in the auditory case, we would not talk of pictures, unlike the photographic case. So there seems that, in a way, recording plus reproducing is not sufficient in order for something to be a picture. For in the photographic case, we talk of depictions, and whereas in the auditory case, we don't say that the sounds that are reproduced are depictions of the original sound. This is my first question. The second question goes exactly in the other direction. That is that I would like to extend the range of pictures and to cover also what you call photographic images or recordings in a way. Or it seems to me, and precisely the case of a smartphone seems for me to go in that direction. Before taking a picture with my smartphone, I just check a lot of possible pictures, so to speak, in which different arrays of lights are recorded. And then at a certain point, I just click and I produce a single picture. But I wouldn't say that the arrays of lights that were already available and that were moving, so to speak, they were just disappearing as soon as I moved my smartphone, are not pictures. I would call them pictures as well, just as the final picture that I managed to obtain. And simply what changes is the causal relationship between the original scene, in that as far as the photographic images are concerned, the scene must not be only existent, but must also be present, which has not to be the case in the case of a picture in which, as you said in the first example, the original subject might completely disappear. So in both cases, there is a causal relationship, but in the case of images of recordings, the causal link seems to me that is narrower in a way. Then I also have an anecdote, but I can come back to that later.
You can do the anecdote if you want, Alberto. Your anecdote.
Okay, I show you my anecdote. Probably you know, oops, where is it? Let me see whether I can, oops, sorry. No, I can't. Try again. Maybe.
Oh, right. The Shroud of Turin. Okay, lovely. Yes,
This is the anecdote because maybe you know the story. But what we take to be the famous picture of Jesus, say, is actually a negative.
Yes.
Because the original photographer of the shroud was an amateur, just discovered in a way that it was something weird by seeing the negative. Because what we see and we take to be the picture of Jesus, so to speak, is just the negative of the photographs that were originally taken by the photographer. And for believers, the explanation is that the original shroud is a footprint because it was imprinted, so to speak, by the light of Jesus' corpse. But of course,
Yes. Yes.
so
Yes.
we have an example in Turin in which a negative is actually not a recording but a reproduction in your terminology.
Yes. I
So
can't
that's the
believe.
anecdote.
I cannot believe that I did not think of that to include in this talk. I mean, that's, yeah. Oh, that's great actually, and that's a very rewarding example because there are so many layers that need to be interrogated about what people think is involved. That's very nice. Okay, so when it comes to the music recording cases, the sound recording case, the Pink Floyd thing. So another direction that I want to go is obviously I think there's a direct parallel with, as it were, sonic registration, sonic reproduction, sonic recording, which can be pretty flat across all different uses of the recording medium. So it doesn't presuppose art, for example. It's just across any kind of sonic recording. And I think that the parallel with mine works with photography perfectly well. But I think there's another way that the analogy between the music case and the photography case, where we're now thinking about the case of intentional content, aesthetic achievement, pictorial representation, those sorts of things, is really interesting and illuminating. So there's an article that I'm kind of working on at the moment, which is to do with saying, look, instead of thinking about photographs as an analogy with paintings and drawings and visual art, think about the creative process in photography as an analogy with the creative process in music. Think about it as the parallel between composing and performing. So Ansel Adams claims this. He says, you know, a negative is a score and prints are performances. You can produce many different interpretations from the score, many different performances. So I'm writing an article that's all about that at the moment. But the funny thing is that where I would like that article to go, and I don't go there with it at the moment, it's like it would be the next thing along, is to talk about how if you look at the development of the music industry, you know, so Ansel Adams is talking about a classical composer performer paradigm, which only works for some kinds of photographic creative processes. A lot of photographers don't work like that, but some do. Whereas if you look at things like multi-track recording studio production processes and synthesized instruments and all these sorts of effects, you've got there the parallel for what we can expect to see in the photography world 20 years, well, I don't know, generously 40 years ahead of where photography is. In other words, what musicians have been doing with studio recordings and other sorts of ways of producing work, it was happening a long time before we were willing to accept it and recognize it in the photography case. It was partly to do with the fact that chemical photography took longer to advance into electrical, you know, digitized processes than music did. The digitization happened in music much earlier than in photography, really. But I think there's an argument to be said that it gets much more interesting when you look at those sorts of parallels, instead of insisting on looking at parallels between painters and photographers and so on, that we tend to be a bit stuck in that mindset. So I think I would go in that direction. Now, when you were talking about the smartphone case, you know, that we all kind of, I'm going to do this to all of you in a minute. This might be a good moment actually to do this for you. If anybody's willing to come on camera, you don't have to come on camera, but if you would be willing to come on camera for my photograph, I would like to point my image at you here. So anybody who's on screen at the moment, I'm going to get your photograph. That is my photograph of the day. So when I was doing that, as you were saying, you know, I am looking at a moving image here, and there's a sense in which I'm waiting till it points at the right direction, and then I'm selecting from it. And what I kind of take away from that is my sort of picture. But you were wanting to say that there's a sense in which what we've got there already is a picture, right? Now, I'm going to agree with you, and then I'm going to take back my agreement. Because I'm going to say that what we're looking at on a screen, and I showed an example of this on my slides, when we're looking at a mobile phone screen, we are not looking at a light image. Okay, because the light image in a mobile phone camera is about that big, and it lies inside just behind the lens on the sensor. That's what the light image is. It's a tiny little thing that lands on the sensor. What we look at here is not a light image. It's already a rendering of the registered data from the light image. So that's why I would agree with you that this is a kind of picture. Right? But what we're not doing is getting the little light image there, and calling that a picture would be quite a different phenomenon, I think. So, but yeah, sorry, I've gone off. But yeah, and I like your anecdote very much. I should have thought of using that.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
If there's time, I have a question, but only if no one else will.
Sure.
I just had a question. I'm not sure if it's more a question for you or for the Kuviki's account of recording. So if I understood correctly, you're against the idea that in photography, we record the scene or the look of the scene, because what we do is we record distribution of light or something like that. And I guess, so if I remember correctly, something that Vicky said is, well, scene is something particular and can't be reproduced, whereas a pattern of light is the kind of thing that is reproduced, and another pattern of light counts as a reproduction of a pattern of light. And I was wondering whether it doesn't matter that it is a particular pattern of light that is recorded rather than a pattern of light that looks like that. So if part of the idea with the photograph is that it has special connection, causal connection at least, with a particular scene, a certain time and spatial position and whatnot, then maybe you would want to say that something, that what is recorded is still particular. So just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
That's brilliant. That's really important. Kulvicki does say things about this when he starts to look. As I say, he's got a really rich account of recording representation, and I haven't done justice to it because I've only covered a tiny bit of that. But he's got a paper called Timeless Traces of Temporal Traces of Timeless Patterns. Temporal Traces of Timeless Patterns. And what he's doing there is thinking about the nature of the patterns and the idea that they are abstract, they are strictly speaking timeless. As you say, they are not particulars with temporal indexes, as it were. And he interrogates the idea that you could have one and the same pattern that would be produced. I think his example is pointing it at the Grand Canyon, or no, Yosemite, the Yosemite National Park. So you point it at Yosemite Park and you get a pattern. And then if you photograph your photograph of Yosemite, you get something that instantiates the same pattern, even though you would want to say one of those is a photograph of this object on my desk, and the other one was a photograph of Yosemite Park, and yet they're indistinguishable at the level of the merely abstract pattern. And what do we say about this, and so on. So he does go into that detail. I'm glad you've pointed that out, because it's something I didn't end up thinking about in a clear way when I was writing this paper. But it's something that matters to me and is in the back of my mind when I'm thinking more generally about the notion of the photographic event. So as I've explained in this paper, when I talk about the photographic event, I don't mean something that just is an exposure, for example, producing an exposure. A photographic event, I'm trying to think of as a slightly more richer notions, more substantial notion I can do more with. And part of that is I want to capture something about the particularity of the event at a particular moment in time, and that it makes a difference that it's one person standing in front of the camera. You get this a nice example of this guy who's one of a pair of twins, and his brother was ill when it came to the prom night. So the guy stood in for his brother so that he could still have his prom photo in the yearbook, and he puts on a different, he puts on a different facial because one of them's very serious and one of them's very funny. So, but I would want to say, okay, we kind of, that works quite well as a portrait of the two individuals in one sense. You might say that the abstract pattern, the bare bones content is fine in both cases. But we would want to say that the particularity of the fact that it was that person and not that person in front of the camera during the photographic event is a difference that makes a difference. And I want to say that the notion of a photographic event is a causal notion that involves those particulars at that moment in time in a causal relation. So I would want to say that something very significant about that. For Kulvicki, it doesn't matter quite the same, because he's in a way looking for a more general account of recording processes. And he is interested in how it applies to sound and to the visual case and everything. So he's kind of, his starting point is to think about recording processes and the implications for recording recordings and recording, you know, that kind of thing. Whereas I'm interested principally in the photography part of it. And what I'm doing, I think, is what I'm adding to Kulvicki is I'm taking his account of recordings and I'm adding account of photographic event and causal registration that shows what the kind of substance is that the recordings have to build on in the photographic case. And I think I would want to say something about exactly what you've just said.
Yeah, that was very helpful. I wonder whether, I'm not really sure, I mean, I haven't thought about it, but I wonder whether it would matter to your account that there is some way of making sense of the event being particular, the recording event being a particular event, also for making sense of the kind of agential interventions at various points in the process. But I'm not sure, like, where it matters that I'm able to intervene at this point in time in this particular, on this particular process or in this particular image, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it goes back to the point you were making earlier about where there are some, you know, some splashes might happen. There's some aspects of the materiality that I'm kind of, as you said, it's a give, you know, it's more of a given than other aspects. And I think it, yeah, I mean, I would want to say that. One of the things I have talked about in the past when I've spoken to photographers and practitioners, and I try to see to what extent what I'm claiming fits their account, you know, and is not just a sort of philosophical theory that floats free of what they see themselves as doing. And I've talked even in one place to some photographers who, for example, it makes a difference to them whether the camera is on a tripod or handheld, right? So you might think, well, that's not something that's strictly visible in front of the camera. You wouldn't say that that features in the visible content of the pattern that's being registered and then reproduced. And yet I mean, I'm helping myself to whatever I like here, really, because I'm like, you know, but I think that the photographic event is a set of kind of causal relations between a whole lot of relevant objects in scene. So I think that not just what lies in front of the camera and gets detected by the camera, but what's behind the camera, who's holding it, what kind of atmosphere they've created as a relationship with the person in front of the camera, for example, is salient in that image being that very image, and it makes a difference. And when we learn facts about what was happening, it changes the way that we appreciate the image, I think. So I would want to say that that's part of the photographic event, but it wouldn't be normally considered part of the exposure, let's say.
I was just wondering whether what you were saying at the very end has some sort of similarities with Michael Morris' account of photographs in his last book, for when he says that there is a close connection between photographs on the one end and paintings on the other end, because both paintings and photographs have to do with something that is manipulated in some way. So manipulation actually appeals to some sort of, as Julia was saying, as a sort of agential factor that in some way modifies what could be witless and becomes witty. So the final production that a photograph ends up showing is something that betrays some sort of manipulation anyway, according to your account, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm very interested in a lot of the claims that Michael makes about photography in that. And certainly one of the big the sort of the big forces that's at work in his whole argument is a way of thinking that the idea that photography is fundamentally mind independent and that therefore it is in some sense difficult for human agents to permeate the medium, is that he really attacks that. He challenges that very head on, and he says that this just sort of it's the wrong starting point. In other words, if the starting point is, look, this is a mind independent medium, how do we then explain how human agents manage to do anything with it? That's a bad starting point, and I agree completely. So obviously what I'm doing is trying to sort of say, look, we don't want to start from there. If we could go back in time and persuade the pioneers of photography that impression and all-in-one recording reproduction isn't the right way, isn't the most helpful way to explain what's happening, then I think it would have always been easier to acknowledge the role of human agents in the processes in different ways. And one of the points I would want to make is that I think counting an image as completely witless has got to be an all or nothing matter. I mean, either something is completely witless or it isn't. In a, to satisfy, if you really want that account of what would count as a truly mind independent image, or at least a witless one, that would have to be. But the extent to which images can be witty is incredibly varied. And I mean, it's as varied as everything we've ever seen about the claims about photography. So, selfies on the one hand, and, highly digitally, collaged images in other examples. These are all the huge variety that we see in photography. I just think that schema that I've gives us more ways of locating the differences between different types of photographs, because otherwise we're sort of left with this idea that, well, we've got strict pure photographs on the one hand, and everything else sort of doesn't really count as a photograph. It's a kind of painting or a kind of drawing or a kind of collage and I want to say, well, no, these are photographs. They can be, their principal medium, even though they might owe, stylistic aspects to other media, sure. But and it's interesting. So, for example, Vincent Dualt, whose work I use in this, I met him at a conference because I gave a version of my multi-stage, the usual, and he came up afterwards and said, oh, I'm doing some work and it goes like this. It seems to kind of fit what you're doing. And I noticed that when he writes about his work for an art audience, for an art critic, kind of art gallery audience, one of the things he puts up in there is that people would want to say that what he's doing is drawing, painting. And he says, obviously I'm using fluid, the materiality of fluids is a big important part of my creative process. That's kind of what's inspiring me and so on. But it's important to me that I'm producing photographs. And so I quite like it that my argument gives a kind of philosophical backing to the claim that he is making as an artist on behalf of his own creative process. And I just think that it's helpful to have this big opening up. So one of the things I want to say about it is that my account doesn't settle that question about how do we know whether it's really what the agent intended or not, and that difficulty. So we get a problem in scrutin, and again, Julia, this goes back to your point about what, and I think something Andreas said in his very first question, is almost like, well, might we have to say that every detail of the image is under the control of the artist to be able to claim that it's a picture? Like, do we have to? Scrutin would say you do. He would say if there are any details that are there purely causally and not intentionally, then what you've got is a species, is not strictly a photograph. And obviously I'm denying that. But I think it's an open question as to exactly how many of the details could be outside the control of the photographer and it still be an artwork, you know. But as I said in the paper, my hope is just to kind of open that as a big question, not to answer it.
I have just a curiosity. Yeah, I have just a curiosity. It's not a question, actually. Which would be, in your scheme, the position of those photographs that are produced not by humans, but by a software mixing photographs coming from a database or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one direction that my stuff feeds into is the kind of the art world questions, you know, sets of questions about artistic appreciation and so on. And obviously there are other sets of questions that feed into stuff like artificial intelligence, machine imaging, deep fakes, databases of face recognition technology and surveillance and all the other ways in which photographically registered data gets analysed, recombined, re-rendered in different ways and produces different kinds of images. And that's a massive question. I mean, Dom Lopez is inclined to say that if something has a photographic event in its etiology, as it's kind of, you know, the origin of it is a photographic event, then even if what you've done with it further down has gone a long way away from being what you'd think of as just a straightforward photographic reproduction of the scene, even if it's been put through loads of additional stages, and he's still quite inclined to say that it can be called a photograph. In other words, that he goes a long, he's very permissive, very liberal with what he calls a photograph. And I'm not sure where the boundaries lie at that end between what we can call a photo. And I think the final point that I make at the end of the paper here is to say, well, I think that it helps to remove the question, what is this a photograph, as if it's the primary question. And if we replace that with something like, is this an image that had a photographic event in its causal history? Like, and to what extent is that photographic event salient in what we're doing with it, or whatever? That's more helpful than asking the question, is it a photograph, ultimately? And so I think there are going to be some examples of sort of database produced images that I would want to say they're not really, you know, photograph. I mean, there are some examples where you get highly photorealist stuff appearing, for example, as screen grabs from computer games, computer animated games, and they get called photographs, in-game photography. And I would say that I would rule them out categorically because they don't involve the causal registration of light. Oh, I think your mic is.
Thank you, because I was interested in this point because there are analogous problems also in other art, of course. Think about the automatic writing of softwares, of poetry, and I wanted to know which was your advice. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Claire Anscombe is doing some interesting work on the idea about AI artists and the use of artificial intelligence technologies for the production of art. And she does some stuff on photography. And I had noticed recently, there was just a news report a couple of days ago I saw that is advertising effectively, as it were, an AI robot to take your photographs for you. So the thought is that even if you've got a camera, we're often not very good at pointing it in the right direction and working out how the light falling on our subject is going to actually be optimized. And, you know, that's why we get people with their faces kind of half in shadow and things like this. Whereas the idea is that if you have an AI robot holding the camera, then they kind of work out what's optimal for the scene and point it in the right direction and get the light right before they even press the button, as it were. So the thought is that you can, you know, that we're not even, it turns out, very good at working cameras. Yeah, but I mean, what you're asking there is exactly what we need to be thinking about over the next few years, isn't it? Those sorts of questions. Yeah.
Okay, unfortunately, I think that we are running out of time, so we have to stop this very fascinating and interesting discussion. So it is time for us to thank again Dawn for his talk, and hopefully we will have you in presence sometime in Turin. It would be hard to accompany you and see the shroud because it is exposed just, if I remember correctly, each 15 years, but still, it would be great to have you in Turin sometime.
I'm ever so grateful to you. That was really, really helpful, and lovely to meet you all as well. Okay, and if you're ever in Hull, you know, if you ever find yourself in England, you know, I can welcome you here as well. Okay.
Okay, very
all
good.
Right. Take care. Thank you indeed. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye.